All right. Welcome to a new year of Theology Nights. This year we're focused on prayer and spirituality. So we've been going through the catechism, essentially, the 4 pillars of the catechism each year in our faith formation program, and we've been mirroring our Theology Nights for adult formation on the same topics that are happening in the upcoming week with our family faith formation. And so the pillars of the catechism that we've been going through, we spent time going through salvation history, through the creed, through what we believe, and then we spent a year looking at the sacraments and the way we worship and how we pray. And then the 3rd year focused on the moral life and how we live and knowing right and wrong. And the 4th year now, the 4th pillar of the catechism, is really all on prayer. So this year we're going to take a look at prayer and spirituality and what that means. And I don't know about you, but when I think about prayer like that, I kind of think, well, isn't that just kind of a one-night topic? It just seems like you could cover prayer in a night. And we're going to spend an entire year talking about prayer. That should tell us something, that there's a lot that we can dive into on prayer. I was speaking with someone today, and he reminded me that the 4th part of the catechism was written by a priest. The bulk of it was written by a priest living in Beirut during wartime. And so this whole chapter, this whole section of the catechism is really coming out of this man's experience of the only thing I can do for the world is pray and pray for peace and to be surrounded by the terror of the world and the terror of war, and to know that this whole thing comes out of that. That's pretty impressive. If you go and read the 4th part of the catechism on prayer, just kind of tuck that in the back of your mind that this comes out of an experience of war. And as it then goes through all of its channels and processes, it's cleaned up, and many eyes and many hands had a look at that before John Paul II promulgated the catechism. But it's just fascinating to remember that there are human authors to this thing that help us really dive in, delve in, and understand the life of the church and prayer. So tonight, we're going to begin taking a look at our first topic, prayer. What is it? And particularly, our relationship with God through salvation history. And so we want to look at really what's called the covenant drama. That as we start to understand how God is acting in our lives. And that's important, that word acting, that God just isn't sitting there doing nothing, but God is acting. He is active in this journey, and He calls us to be active in this journey of prayer. So we ask ourselves, what is prayer? Let's start with that question. I think a lot of times we think of prayer as the things we say to God. Kneeling down or going to a church or having our rosary beads or whatever. We're saying prayers. We're uttering these things. And we're trying to talk to God, to communicate with God. I think a very simple definition of prayer that the church uses is to raise the mind and the heart to God. And that's an easy definition to remember, but it's one that I think we often forget a whole part of it. To raise the mind and the heart to God. Because I think for many, prayer can be the raising of the mind to God. That we're thinking about things, and we're talking to God, and we're using words, and we're going through our book, and we're reading our reflections, and all of those things that are of the head. And that is good, but it's only halfway to prayer. It doesn't get you the whole way. The other half of that is raising the heart to God, mind and heart being lifted up to God. So I'm not just talking to God, but I'm also experiencing God in my heart. I'm feeling things. I'm expressing things. I'm aware of what's going on inside of me, not just in my head, but also in my heart. Now, some of us are more thinkers than we are feelers, and it's much easier to talk about the thoughts that are going through our head. Others of us are much better feelers than we are thinkers. And we know what's happening in our heart and in our gut, and we just have this thought about it, or this feeling about it, rather. Putting those two together can be difficult, melding those two, especially if I tend to be more a head person, or I tend to be more a heart person. Engaging that other aspect of my person, that's a challenge. So if you know you're a head person, then you will probably be challenged in your prayer to be more of a heart person. Like, God wants to encounter me in my heart. Or vice versa. If you're that heart person, God is going to want to challenge you and meet you in your head. I find this oftentimes working with couples preparing for marriage, or even married couples, because many times in that relationship, one tends to lean a little more towards the head, the other tends to lean a little more towards the heart and the feelings, and they balance one another out, and they kind of create that whole picture, that you complete me sort of thing. That's what God wants to do in His relationship with you. He wants to complete, and He wants to pull out of you what is not already naturally there. So he wants to bring that out. If you are that head person, He's going to tug on your heart, and that's going to confuse the heck out of you. I don't understand what's happening. Or if you are the heart person, He's going to start working in your head, and you're just not feeling it. God will challenge that place to make the whole picture come together. So when we think about prayer as raising the mind and the heart to God, it really is about this whole being. I was speaking to someone recently about that very thing, and talking about bringing the heart to God came up, because I think this person must have been a processor, a head person, very much like myself, I think, in many ways. And the challenge was, how do I say the things to God that I am feeling when I know I shouldn't be feeling them? Like, I feel this towards God. Maybe I feel abandoned, or I feel angry, or I feel like God doesn't care. My experience is darkness, or my experience is desolation. And that makes me angry, or it puts me into despair, or fill in the blank. And my head tells me that's not right. I shouldn't be angry with God. I shouldn't be in despair. I know He loves me. I know better. This is what a thinker will tell themselves. I know better. I shouldn't do these things. And that's all fine and good, but then without knowing it, we end up carrying a grudge towards God, that I'm not expressing to God the things of my heart. He knows what we're feeling, and He knows what we're thinking, so it's not like we can hide that from Him. And I think we pretend that we can. It's like, well, I'm not going to say this to God, as if He doesn't already know. It's not like talking to someone else. So I'm never going to tell that person what I really think about them, or what I really feel about them. I'm going to be very nice, and I'm going to think all these other thoughts about them. We can't do that with God, because He knows what's going on in our heart and in our mind. So we might as well just express it. So if there are things going on in the heart, bring them to God. If there are things going on in the head, bring it to God. Because I think part of prayer is that self-revelation of what is happening within me, because I don't know. I don't know what's happening within me. I don't know what I'm doing inside here, and I don't know what God is doing inside here. And the only way I can start to know that is by communicating. Communication is not only revealing ourselves to someone else, but it is revealing ourselves to ourselves. That's why human beings are created as social creatures. We are created for communion. We're created for relationship, because in isolation, you cannot know yourself. It is impossible to know yourself on your own. These stories or these comics or whatever, where the person, just goes off and I'm going to go climb a mountain and I'm going to go be in the wilderness or whatever for 3 months or a year or whatever, and I'm just going to be I'm going to go find myself, all by myself. It's impossible. You cannot know yourself outside of relationship. We find ourselves in relationship, primarily in our relationship with Jesus Christ. That's where we find ourselves. When I open myself up to God and let God in, and when I open myself up and put something out there to God, now all of a sudden I can see this stuff coming out of me, and I can see the stuff that's going in, and I begin to see who I am. I know who I am in God. And that's true for any relationship. You know yourself better when you are relating with someone. You might scare yourself. You might delight yourself. You might be surprised. You might whatever. When you hear the words coming out of your mouth to this person, I can't believe I just said that to you. How many times have we said or done something like that? And all of a sudden, we see revealed something from within ourselves. So prayer is that communication with God that lets Him in and lets ourselves go out to Him, both head and heart, so that we can know Him and know ourselves better. He already knows us, so we don't have to introduce ourselves. He wants us to know us, and He wants us to know Him. At the root of prayer, this is what happens. We are building this relationship where communion happens. Prayer is about fostering relationship. Prayer is about establishing communion. It is the opening up and receiving of the other into your life and putting yours into someone else's. And ultimately, then, that's what prayer is. So prayer isn't about completing a chapter, or it's not about getting through the pages. It's not about number of decades said. It's not about all of that's not prayer per se. Those might all be parts of prayer, but they're not prayer by themselves. I have to ask myself, when I do these prayers, is it fostering the relationship with God? Am I getting to know Him better? Are you kidding me? It had 3 bars on it before, my battery. Deacon Steve will go get me a new one. So this prayer that happens is a communion of relationship. How am I relating to God? So tonight, we want to look at that from the vantage point of salvation history. But I just want to pause right there and just maybe take some general questions about just prayer in general, if there are any questions or maybe thoughts or things that you would like to see addressed or anything like that. So let's pause for a question or two. Yeah.
One of the classic questions is,
how do you know your prayers are answered? Especially if we're in this relationship and I'm putting something out there, how do I know? How do I know that, A, this is God talking to me, first of all? How do I know what I'm hearing in my head is of God? And then how do I know what effect maybe it has? Yeah. So again, that's a very good question, because I think it speaks to the head and the heart element of prayer. That we sometimes think about prayer as cause and effect. That when I pray, it should have some effect. Either it should have an effect within me, or it should have an effect within someone else, or it should have an effect in the world, and we begin looking for those causes and effects. And I'm not sure that that's exactly where we ought to be looking, because then in prayer, I am looking for something outside of God. I'm looking for, pause while I put this in. Hello, hello, hello. It says I have bars. It's probably the thing. I don't think that will work on this system. Okay, so you're just going to have to peek your ears so that you can hear me better. Prayer is not about making things happen. That we do have, and we'll talk about this as we go on through this series, when we talk about the kinds of prayer, particularly intercessory prayer. And this is something that I think your question speaks to. Like when I intercede for someone or when I ask God for something on behalf of someone, how do I know what happens? I'll answer it just briefly tonight because we'll get to it at a later night. Briefly put, I don't in terms of the specifics, and I'm really not supposed to. That's none of my business. That I participate in the desire of goodness. And then if God is going to work something in someone else's heart or in the world, now that's between him and them. I have played my part and I exit the stage. And I let the next player take over. And that can be hard sometimes because we want to know the effect. I want to know that my efforts did something. So it kind of speaks to that, but we'll definitely get more into that when we start talking about intercessory prayer.
Some people have a real hard time asking for help. How would one get past that?
People have a hard time asking for help. Are you talking about from others or from God? Or both? Okay. Yeah. That speaks to the opening of the mind and the heart. So we have a hard time asking for help sometime, admitting the fault or the brokenness or whatever. And what that really is we ultimately have a hard time being vulnerable. That I really don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to show you that I need help. I don't want to show God that I don't have this figured out. So I kind of want to fix it myself and then bring it to God or then bring it to someone else. It's like we're a project that isn't complete yet. And that's certainly the way I operate. I don't want people seeing my work half finished. If I'm in the middle of writing something or doing some kind of art or whatever, I don't want it to be seen until it's done. And as human beings, we do that too. I don't want you to see me until I'm ready, until I'm done, until I'm perfected. That closes the door then for the heart to engage in prayer. And I think the way we overcome that is, it's like anything. We just have to practice it. I have to practice asking for little things or admitting little things so that I start to get used to that and then can start asking for or admitting those bigger things. It's kind of, it's the, this sounds very trite, but it's the small steps, the one day at a time, all of those kind of things, but that's very true. Mother Teresa would say, if we want to pray better, we have to pray more. That if we want to open up that part of ourselves, we just have to do it regularly and ask people for help in simple things that I'm not embarrassed about. And then that starts to open up those other areas of my life. Posture, gestures, all of that stuff when it comes to prayer. Praying with eyes open, praying with eyes closed, praying standing, sitting, kneeling, walking, running, whatever. No. Unless it it keeps you from focusing on God. So if it helps me to close my eyes because it blocks out some distraction, great. If I close my eyes and immediately fall asleep, not so great. So finding that balance of, our bodies have to be engaged in prayer as well. So prayer is not just an interior thing, it's an exterior thing too. Because we're not angels, in many ways. We are not angels. We have bodies. And so our bodies are engaged in prayer. So do I kneel? Do I stand? Do I sit? Do I recline? Do I walk? All of these things. What helps you to open up and to focus on God? And if those certain things help you, then do that. If they don't, then don't do that. If I'm going to kneel and worry about how I'm going to get back up, maybe kneeling in prayer is not the best answer. Or if it's just all you start thinking about is your aching back, don't kneel while you're praying. Stand, sit, whatever. Okay, one more and then we'll move to the next topic. Sure.
For those around us in our lives who are either no faith or little faith, when you see that they need praying for, is it best to pray for their situation or conversion in the heart?
How do we pray for other people? This will also come up in this intercessory topic, but let me just speak to it a little bit today. I don't know necessarily what to pray for a particular individual. And this could be anything. This could be we see that they are closed, or that they don't have faith, or that they have a health issue, or whatever. What do I pray for? Do I pray for their healing? Do I pray for the strength they need to get through the illness? Do I pray for a conversion of heart? Do I pray? I don't know. I think the best prayer, this is why the Lord gives us the Lord's Prayer, because the right from the get-go, thy will be done. That, Lord, I want your will for this person to be done. And however I can participate in that, I want to do that. So sometimes I think that's the easiest thing to do, that I just want what you want for this person, God, and I want to unite my will, my choice, my desire in that. And that really does take it off of us, because how do I know what's good for you? I might be praying for this person's healing, and God has no intention of healing that person because it's this illness that's going to make that person holy. And so by praying for their healing, I am praying for them out of their path of holiness. So I should be very careful in terms of, as that God knows, I'm not going to change God's mind. But what I end up doing is I might end up discouraging myself, because I'm praying for healing and a miracle, and it never happens, and I think then that God has not answered my prayer, when in fact, He's doing what He needs to do in that person's life, and I need to change my mindset to be more in tune with His. And so I think that is a perfect transition into talking about prayer as our relationship with God through salvation history. Because when we look at how God has related to humanity from the beginning until now, that sits at the heart of it. That the heart of prayer ultimately is, I want my mind, my will, to be conformed to the mind of God. I want my desires to be God's desires. I want my heart to be God's heart. My wants to be God's wants. So that's why we have to spend time in prayer with God, getting to know Him more and more, so that my heart becomes more like His, my mind becomes more like His, and then I start to know more what I should be asking for. And I realize those kinds of prayers are going to be fruitless. So I am not going to pray in that manner anymore. I am now going to pray in this way. And St. Paul talks about that. He says, when I was a child, I acted like a child. I did things like a child. I was obnoxious like a child. And then when I became a man, I started acting like a man, and I was more mature, and this, that, and the other thing. Same thing with us in our spirituality. We oftentimes begin our prayer very childish, that I just kind of pray for the things that I think I should be praying for, or what seem good to me in my estimation, and all of these sorts of things. When really, my prayer is to come to God and say, change my mind. God, I don't want to change your mind. I want you to change my mind. God, I don't want you to see things from my perspective. I want to see things from your perspective. That's a hard thing to ask. But it is what Christ tells us in this Sunday's gospel even, that if you want to be my disciple, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And that word in the Greek, deny yourself, what the author wrote, what Mark wrote, basically means stop following yourself and follow me. To deny, that word deny yourself, means don't chase after the things that you want, but now come after me. Take up the things you don't want. Take up seeing things from a different perspective. Take up that cross. So prayer, I think again, Mother Teresa said it. It's not so much that prayer changes God or prayer changes God's mind, but prayer changes me, and then I am able to change the things that I am praying about. That I become the answer to the prayer. That it's kind of like, even as a teacher, if someone asks something, or if you're heading a committee and someone brings something up and you say, that is a good idea. Why don't you serve as the chairperson for that project? And I think that's oftentimes what God wants to do. That is brilliant. I'm glad you brought that to me. I put that in your heart because I want you to take that and run with it now. And so it's about changing us and making us participate more in God and His plans. So prayer, it's not about changing God. It's not about changing the world. Ultimately, and this sounds selfish, but prayer is about changing me. So I guess to go back to your question, how do I know if my prayers are answered? Am I changing? Am I the one that's being changed in all of this? If I am, then my prayers are being answered. If I am not being changed, then my relationship with God is lacking something. So this relational question we begin to see in salvation history. So let's go back to the beginning, to Adam and Eve. And we see that God has created Adam and Eve, man and woman, to be in relationship with Him. Let us make man in our own image. Male and female, He created them. And He wanted us to share the relationship that He had with the rest of the Trinity. Father, Son, Holy Spirit have this wonderful relationship of communion, communication with one another, constant, full, total, loving. And now God creates us to be like that, to share that. He wants us to come into that very same reality. And Jesus will speak about this towards the end of His mission on earth, when He Himself prays to the Father, I pray that they will be in us as we are in one another. I pray that there will be that total union, that total openness that we have. That's what I want them to have. All the way back to the very beginning of creation, that's what God desires for us. I want you to be in me. So that answers what prayer is about. Prayer is about getting in to God. How do I get into God? How do I enter into God and having that relationship with Him? Adam and Eve begin in paradise, share that loving relationship with God where everything is naked. that original nakedness is an original openness, that there is nothing hidden from you, God. Then there is no sin to keep me from you. Our relationship is open, perfect sharing. And so the scriptures describe Adam and Eve as talking with God as one person talks to another, that there is just nothing between us. And then when sin enters into the world, it ruptures that relationship, and the scriptures describe that as Adam and Eve felt God's presence in the garden, and they ran and hid themselves from them. And then they began making clothing for themselves because they realized they were naked and had to hide themselves from one another and from God. This kind of goes back to your question about, I don't want to ask for the help, I don't want to reveal myself completely. Sin has caused that. Sin has challenged us, and now it makes us want to believe that I can't show you something. I've got to hide myself from God and one another. So that original nakedness is lost, and that's really speaking about our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. So now the great journey, again, the drama of the covenants begin. And we see how God develops and establishes his covenant with his people. And I just want to pause here for a second and talk a little bit about covenant. When we speak about a covenant, we're talking about an unbreakable relationship. That God establishes a covenant with us that says, I want you to be my people, and I want to be your God. And I want that relationship to be so strong that it is unbreakable. And all throughout the Old Testament, he is going to use the nuptial relationship as the image. So again, prayer with God, we might benefit by thinking about it in a nuptial relationship. That I am coming to love God, and that God is coming to love me. And he desires that deep and profound love that is shared between us, that unites body and soul. He wants to consummate that relationship in us in prayer. And this is why some of the great saints throughout history will describe their prayer in ecstatic terms. They will speak about ecstasy, that they experience this passionate embrace of love felt in body and soul in their union with God. That's ultimately the framework that we're thinking about when we enter into relationship with God, when we enter into prayer with God. How do I enter into the deepest, most profound, loving encounter with my spouse? That's prayer with God. That I want to have that kind of love and union with him. It's the heart of the Trinity. This union and this burning, passionate love. So God desires that. Sin loses that, ruptures that, bends it, messes it up. And so God now begins to establish covenants with people to remind them of this relationship. And so the first one I want to talk about tonight is Abraham. The covenant with Abraham is significant because the covenant with Abraham reminds us of faith. That in order to have a relationship with God, it has to begin in faith. That faith is the two-way street. God reaches out to us, and we accept that and reach back out to God. So it's almost like faith is, I'm willing to embrace you. I don't know everything about you, but I'm willing to embrace you. It's kind of like the hug greeting. You know, and in many cultures, the hug greeting happens even with people you don't know. Like, this is the first time I'm meeting you, and it's traditional to give that kind of embrace. Well, there's an act of faith in that. And I think if I'm not mistaken, that a lot of our greetings came with human beings as an act of faith. That I am going to extend my hand out to you, and you are going to extend your hand out to me, because this is the hand I draw my sword with. And if I put my hand out here, I can't draw my sword. I am now entering in. This is an act of faith, that you are not going to slit my throat. That our greetings with one another really begin as an act of faith. It is the embrace. And so God reaches out to Abraham and says, hey, Abraham, here I am. And I need you to do something. Leave this place where you've lived your entire life and go somewhere else and become a new person, become my people. And Abraham says, okay, I will do that. He doesn't know who this guy is, who this God is. He knows nothing. I mean, he has an encounter with God somehow, some way, and his acceptance of that enters into that relationship. So the relationship with Abraham, the prayer of Abraham, is a prayer of faith. That so many times he understands that he has been asked to do something that is very difficult. And every time he says, I don't understand, but you're bigger than me, and I trust you. Leave this place, go to this new place. Take your son that I promised to you up a mountain and sacrifice him. I mean, these are things that no person in their right mind would do. And yet Abraham does, because he believes that what this God is asking him is going to be good. It's going to be better than what he could have given himself. So when we think about faith in prayer, we approach God first from that perspective. Do I believe you're bigger than me, God? Do I believe that you see things that I don't? Do I believe that you love me and the world and everyone else more than I do? Do I really believe that? Then that takes the pressure off me. I don't have to pray the right way. I don't have to ask for the right intention. I don't have to come up with the answer, because I believe and trust that you got this covered. What you're asking me to do is participate with you in it. That's what I need to learn more of. So Abraham begins that journey, and we have always called him then Abraham, our father in faith, that he teaches us how to have faith, because any prayer journey begins with us not knowing God very well, but giving ourselves to him anyway. I'm going to spend time with you. It seems like I'm wasting time, but I think this is going to be good, so I'm going to do it. Even if I don't feel it, or even if I don't think it. I'm just going to say yes. And that's the first step of the journey. So let me pause there. Any questions, reflections, discussion on Abraham, or creation, Adam and Eve, Abraham in our relationship with God, and what that has to do with prayer? Okay. Yeah.
If someone struggles with faith, I realize that faith is a gift, and if they're praying for it and still like having a hard time believing, can you just speak to that?
Yeah. Faith is one of the, because when we pray for faith, we expect the answer to be clarity and light and knowledge. And faith is in reality knowing in the dark. And I think that that's the thing that we sometimes mix up in our head, that faith is knowing the things that I cannot see, cannot hear, cannot experience, and yet I still know it. That's faith. But when I pray for faith, I think many times what we're actually praying for is I want the lights to be turned on. And I just want to see. And that's going to be faith. And I'm going to hear. And that's going to be faith because now I got it. Now I know it. But that's not faith. Faith is staying in the darkness and knowing. And so again, it kind of goes back to that, am I asking for the right thing? So that if I'm asking for faith, maybe as I ask God for the gift of faith, that I start asking myself, what is faith? And when I realize that faith is being in the dark, am I okay with that? And then can I start asking God, God, make me okay with being in the dark. Help me to know you in the dark. And so it's that conversation that begins to unfold. And that conversation that begins to unfold, again, starts to open up then that heart and make it more like God's. And that's, yes?
Let's say you don't know what to say in prayer.
Yeah.
Does it count if you're just silent?
Yeah, so prayer. I have nothing to say. I'm just going to be silent. Is that good? Is that kosher? Is that, whatever? Yeah, absolutely. Just as, many times you hang out in a relationship and you can be with someone and you're just being there with them, not saying anything, but that time spent together is very valuable. And that is the same thing with God, that God, I don't have anything to say, or I'm too tired to say, or I'm too exhausted, I'm too much in pain, I'm too much in grief, whatever it is. I just got to be, and I'm just going to be quiet. Personally, I think that's some of the best prayer, because it opens us up more to the listening than to the talking. And when I'm listening to God, I tend to get more out of it than when I'm talking and listening to myself. So I think there can be a real blessing in that sometimes. But that conversation, which involves both the speaking and the listening, this is where the second covenant that we're talking about tonight comes in with Moses. So the covenant that God establishes with Moses is a covenant that invites conversation. Whereas we see in the person of Abraham, that Abraham meets God, receives God, and says, all right, I'll do whatever you say. Moses, on the other hand, is a different personality and more hard-headed or something, I guess, a little bit of a firebrand. And he often argues with God, challenges God, complains to God. He has this whole range of questions God. He's not as docile as Abraham was. But what Moses did, he didn't walk away. He kept the conversation. So with Moses, that relationship was a back and forth. God would say this, and Moses would say, yes, but. And then God would say, well, but. And Moses is like, but. And so there's this thing that goes back and forth between the two of them. And what that ends up doing is what we were talking about before. Moses' mind then begins to change and begins to see things more from the perspective of God. And one of the best examples of this that I can think of is that when God says, it's so many ways along the journey that the people of Israel are just being a real pain in the neck. And sometimes it's Moses who goes to God and says, this people, they're driving me nuts. I can't deal with this anymore. Just kill me. And sometimes God comes to Moses and says, this people of yours, they're driving me crazy. I'm just going to kill them. And it's interesting because would God really say that? Is that really what God would do? What God is doing is he's entering into this relationship with Moses, because then what does Moses have to do? Moses has to start fighting for the people. Oh God, you can't do that. If you kill them, then everyone else is going to think that you're a vicious, mean God, and who's going to come to faith in you? Well, all these people, the Egyptians, they'll say, ha ha, we told you, you were better off with us. We can't do that. So when God puts this before Moses, and Moses enters into this conversation, Moses is the one who starts advocating for the very people he was asking to be rid of. Moses' mind and heart begins to change in his conversations with God. God doesn't always take us by the most direct route, because the most direct route doesn't often benefit us. So just like the 40 years in the desert, Moses will let us wander around the hills and through the valleys and over the river and all that stuff, because this journey is going to cause us to spend more time with him, and the more time we spend with him, the more we're going to become like him. So God's okay with taking his sweet time and letting us experience all kinds of heartache along the way, because that's going to change us to be more like him. So Moses' contribution to understanding our relationship with God is really the relationship of the back and forth, the conversation, the challenge, the changing of the mind, all of those things that Moses brings. I'll pause for question or comment or discussion. Matt.
So maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but last year we talked about how the God of the Old Testament seems different than the God of the New Testament. Is what you're talking about with prayer, how God was one way with Adam in the garden, and then Abraham, and then Moses. Does prayer evolve, or does prayer evolve with time? Like God changed with time or evolved with time?
Okay, so what the question is, it's a good question. We understand that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, it's the same God. But if you just were to look at those, it may appear to be completely different perspective. Like the God of the Old Testament does not look like the God of the New Testament by listening to the things that they're recorded as having said. But when you think about how these scriptures are written, that all of these scriptures are written by human beings, and these human beings who are in relationship with God. And so the scriptures are recording a real relationship with God, filtered through the experience of humanity at a particular time. So it's not that God has changed. God has remained the same. But human beings have changed. And human beings' understanding of God has changed. And the way God interacts with human beings has changed. And St. Paul describes this again. He says, when we were young in our faith, we needed a babysitter. We couldn't go on our own. And so God gave us a babysitter. He gave us the law. And the law was our babysitter, because we didn't quite yet understand the law of love that Jesus Christ was calling us to, that God was calling us to. But we weren't there yet. Our relationship with God wasn't there yet. So God had to be more of a disciplinarian with us than being more of a companion with us. So just as you parent your children differently when they are younger and when they are older, and there's going to be a lot that's the same. Like I have to treat my 5-year-old like I treat my 17-year-old. Not mine, but I'm speaking for you, that there are going to be similarities in that, but then there are going to be some very real differences in the way you parent. You are not a different guy to your 5-year-old as you are to your 17-year-old. You're the same guy who wants the same things, who's communicating the same things, but you're communicating it in a way that age can receive. And the Holy Father spoke about this recently, kind of got himself into trouble with the Jewish community, because the Holy Father said that the Torah, the law, is not enough, that we need Jesus Christ to fulfill the law. And he kind of got some pushback from the Jewish community on that, saying, how can you say our law is enough? We live by the law. Are you saying that we aren't, that this is invalid? And the Holy Father's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. It's not invalid, but we understand that Jesus has fulfilled that. And so it is a recognition that faith is always growing and developing and moving, getting bigger. Louise.
I have to, on this, the 20th anniversary of some of the work made in our story, how do those people who are still filled with such grief and such angst, how do they pray? I don't know how they pray. I mean, the question is, why did this happen to my husband or my wife or my brother? How do they get
Yeah.
any serious kind of hurt?
Yeah. So when you find yourself in a place of deep grief or hurt or victim of violence or terror or whatever it is, whether it's on the national scale or in your own very, very personal scale, the question is, how do you pray in that situation? I talk to a lot of people about that, mostly in the confessional, because that's where it comes out. And much of the time, I encourage people to understand that they are going through grief. And that grief, as we know, progresses through many different stages. And so when you do feel angry, or when you do feel like there's no hope and total despair, or when you just want to try to do whatever you can to bring it back or to come back to the way things were with the bargaining, whatever, that's all natural, and that all is part of prayer. That there's no wrong way to bring your grief to God. The thing that the tempter always wants to do, however, and this is the warning or the caveat, is that in our grief, the anger, the bargaining, the despair, the whatever stage we're in our grief, the whispered voice in our head is going to say, this is God's fault, and that you should direct your anger at God. You should direct your despair at God and turn away from Him, because He's not going to help you. Don't bother bargaining with God or having a conversation with God, because He's not going to hear you. Because obviously He let this very bad thing happen. So how can He be this God of love? So the tempter is always going to want to get in there and say, God is the source of the bad thing that you have experienced. And then that closes us down, because I am not going to be vulnerable with someone I don't trust. I'm not going to be vulnerable with someone who's going to stab me when I extend my hand out to them. So to hear that temptation, and goes back to faith. Here's the Abrahamic faith. I know, God, that you are all good, that you are all loving, that you are all powerful. I know that. And so when I relate to you now in my pain and grief and not understanding and all of these things, I have to know that this is not of you. So fill me with what I need. And it's going to be very unique then for everybody's journey. Because everyone is going to process that grief, that anger, that pain differently. But we have to begin with the relationship of Abraham. I know your goodness, God. Don't let the tempter make me believe that you are the source of the evil that I have experienced. And that's the starting point. I think that's the starting point. And then where does it go from there? The conversation. The conversation that I keep having with God. I encourage people to journal, because a lot of times those things that we feel, the anger, the hatred, the despair, the grief, whatever, the things that we are feeling, we don't have words for them. They're just feelings. And until you put words for them, the chaos remains. And so we learn this in the creation story. It is chaotic until God starts putting words to things, and then they begin to materialize and form. Same thing with our heart. It is full of chaos. And until I can start describing, talking about, naming these things, the chaos continues to move in my heart. Have I said the things that I'm feeling? Have I tried to talk them out? Have I tried to put words to them and see them and understand them? A lot of times we don't. I'm too afraid. I don't want to look at that. And so we just keep feeling it. But we have to put those words to the... I'll use my own example. Last 3 weeks ago, my dog died. And it's still hard to talk about that because he's just such a sweetheart. And in all of the feelings, I'm a thinker, but when I have feelings, they are big feelings. And these feelings that I had, just at home, nobody is there, and just bellowing out guttural sounds to get feelings out was an important part of my grieving process. But then trying to express why I'm feeling this way. And, things would come out that I really didn't know that that's why it hurt as much as it hurt. And one of the things that, it's like all of the things that was good, and I'm never going to see him again, and this, that, and the other thing. One of the things was I grieve and I hurt that I can't share him with people. I was so proud of him and loved when people took joy in that encounter with him. And I don't get to do that anymore. I had no idea that that was the reason why I was feeling such pain. But eventually I was able to put words to that. And then all of a sudden something clicked and I'm like, that feels so much better that I was able to name what that pain was. And I think as we work through, that's why the relationship with God, the back and forth that Moses teaches us, because his journey through the desert with those stiff-necked Israelites was hell on earth. And if he didn't enter into that very difficult relationship, that conversation with God over and over again, he would have exploded or imploded or whatever. And I think that's what we all experience when we are in those dark and trying moments. So unless I can back and forth that with God, it just destroys us. So that does tie in with the Moses faith in God, back and forth conversation, and be prepared for the journey. That this might be a twisting and turning journey just to keep digging everything out of there. So the last point, Jesus Christ. We have to jump to Jesus here. I know that's not quite the order of salvation history. There's a lot in between Moses and Jesus Christ. But that's all that was in the lesson plan for this week. So it's Abraham, Moses, Jesus. Because in Jesus, we see all of this fulfilled. And the beautiful image that we use to recognize this is Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman. That the Samaritan woman that he meets at the well is a woman who's lived kind of not the best life, gotten herself into some trouble. Nobody likes her. She's kind of an outcast. Jesus meets her at the well. She's not a woman of Jewish faith, doesn't necessarily think he's God. And so he enters into this conversation with her. And here's where the Abraham and Moses models come together. That in the conversation that he has with her, he brings her to faith. And when she reaches faith, she wants more of that conversation. And you begin to see the catch-22 beginning, that the faith demands conversation, the conversation leads to more faith, And in this long conversation that he has with the Samaritan woman at the well, he brings her to know who he is. And all of a sudden there's this beautiful line when she says, "Tell me who the Messiah is so that I might know him too." And he says, "You are speaking to him." And there's just that mic drop in that moment. And all of a sudden, she just has to run away and go tell people. She has to then have the conversation, with others. And so you just see the bringing together of faith from Abraham, conversation from Moses, and this is fulfilled in Jesus. That when we encounter him, he fulfills it all, because he is God enfleshed. So that we can encounter a human being and have a friendship and have a conversation and put our trust in and our faith in and know what God desires for humanity. And that's where we encounter then who we are in God, which is where we started. What is prayer? Raising of the mind and heart to God. Faith, conversation, faith in Jesus Christ shows us God, shows us who we are. So that's kind of tonight's topic in a nutshell. What is prayer? What is prayer? What do we learn from prayer over the course of salvation history? I did not look ahead, so I can't give you a sneak peek on what the next topic is going to be, but all of the topics this year are going to focus on prayer and spirituality. So we're just going to keep going deeper, and all of these questions that you're raising up, they're going to keep coming back, and we're going to keep entering into this relationship. So any questions to wrap things up here? Okay, look at that faith. You just believe. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. And we will see you next month.